We're going to co-preach this sermon this morning, so it's going to take two of us. Is that all right? If it's not, then you're only going to hear half of it. Well, I've done this before, but I've never done it with you. Well, an hour ago, but prior to that, Emily's been here, 15 years, something like that? But we've never co-preached before, and we're not sure how this is going to go. We may never do it again. Let me give you a little bit of a backstory on it. The genesis of the message, at least, and we've talked about this at length, hours in fact, but the genesis of the message, at least for me, was in May of 2022, right when we as a country were in the midst of a lot of really volatile changes. If you still remember, about 2.5 years ago, we were trying to sort through issues of race and prejudice. We were trying to sort through, as a greater church in the Wesleyan Church, issues of LGBTQ. We knew that was coming to the conference floor that month. I was told that could divide. It didn't, but I was told that could divide us. We were dealing personally with loss as a church. We lost 12 staff members in about 3 years' time. I lost a sister in 6 months' time. And so we're dealing with all of this internal grief and not knowing how to deal with it. And at the same time, we're like having to figure out how to lead something when it felt more like dodgeball than anything else. You catch the ones you can, you get out of the way of everything else. That's not a strategy, but that's how it felt for me. Stumbled across this passage in Acts 27, which I'll call a parable. Now, relax. I'm not suggesting this is only a parable, but if I call it a parable, it allows me to interpret this with a freedom that on that day really helped me. So I'm going to be true to the text. You don't need to, if you're into exegesis, we'll discuss it later. I'm going to keep the text, but I'm going to speak it in parable tones. It starts like this. One night, in the middle of the night, Jesus had a conversation with a lawyer of sorts from the Jewish tradition, where Jesus made a statement that I can't quite understand. He said, "The wind blows where it chooses. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going." And that's how it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Well, it rattled me a little bit. So I stayed there for a moment, and I hope you will. Because if I'm reading him right, what Jesus is saying is there is a kind of person or a kind of thing in this world that is born in this world, but it's not from this world. It has found a way to connect to forces like the wind that are primal and unstoppable and irresistible. They are just bigger than you. And so people that are born of the Spirit are never just acting, they're acted upon, and they know it. So they spend a good part of their lives trying to discern, where is the wind going? What will the wind allow? And what won't it allow in this moment? That changed the game for me, because I was used to leading a church, not navigating a church. I was used to making decisions, was not so good at discernment. But when you're playing with forces that are bigger than you, you're only half of the story. You have to discern as much as you decide. You tracking so far? So a few years, are you? A few years ago, I told you about 3 kinds of watercraft that go through the Holland Channel. And this is where the eyes opened for me. There's a rowboat, there's a motorboat, and then there's a sailboat. And those are 3 different kinds of watercraft. And the more I sat there that day looking at them boats, the more it occurred to me, that's kind of like a lot of different leaders that I know and a lot of different churches that I know. There are rowboat leaders in rowboat churches, which are led primarily by the talent and the strength of one person who sits at the oars and works like crazy to navigate a boat full of people into the direction he or she thinks it should go. And it works for a while, but as the leader gets tired or as they get old and retire, the board panics because they got to find another leader. They got to find somebody to take the oars. And so they search the country, and when they can talk somebody into it, they hire them. And the moment he or she arrives, they hand them the oars, and they go back to their lives. That's about 80% of the churches in this country. It's about 80 to 90% of the leaders. The second kind of watercraft was a motorboat, which isn't the power of a person, it's the power of a system. It's never one person that leads that. It's a system of boards, committees, policies, processes, and when those things work together, it's like an engine that pushes that thing forward. So when the leader says, oh, I could step away tomorrow and they won't even miss me, sometimes he or she is right because they have built such a powerful engine of processes and systems, it literally runs itself. And we call that in America good leadership. The problem is that in inclement weather, those systems become rigid and fragile, and we won't let them go. We get so focused on doing things right because that's how we got here that we can't do the right thing. Had to be another way. The sailboat.
Yeah, the sailboat church seems to have a different advantage. That is, if it can harness that primitive force that Jesus was talking about in the wind, right? So if you know how to navigate the winds and how to direct the power of the wind towards the destination where you're going, then depending on the speed of the winds and your ability to navigate them, you're able to travel at the same speeds as you are in a motorboat, but without losing so much energy and power that you would when you use the rowboat for so long. That's the upside. The downside, of course, is that we can't control the wind. So if you're a control freak like I am, that's a problem. You can't control the wind. Jesus said it blows wherever it chooses. So you can only go as fast as the winds allow, and you can almost never travel in a straight line. You have to adapt the course of your vessel, because in the end, you go where the winds will allow you to go. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily change your destination, but you do often have to change your expectations of how you're going to get there and how quickly you'll arrive. And so I think leading a sailboat church then would take incredible patience and humility. Ultimately, you'll get where you're going, but it just may not be when and how you thought you'd get there.
Patience and humility, both of which I'm short on, right? So this was the big paradigm shift. And don't think this is a small thing, because this has applications for your life as well. The question I faced early that morning was, why am I afraid of the wind? Why am I always thinking of the wind as opposition? And if it is, why is opposition always a bad thing? Now translate that into your individual lives. and see the kind of shift in your mindset you would have to make if you started living your life and making your decisions as though you were only half of the decision. Because most of us, even ministers, are used to thinking of God as a bit further removed, and He's sort of assigned to us the task of running this family or leading that organization. But it never occurs to us that God is actively and daily invested in the movements of our day. And if He is, that means He's moving. So it's not about me just deciding where do I want to go and then doubling down until I get there. It becomes more about what will the wind allow? How do I take that which was resisting, adjust the sail until it catches? And the thing resisting me will actually carry me forward. You see it? Well, this is where the parable of Acts 27 comes in. Not going to read the whole story to you. Just want to point a couple of things out. One is that the wind is mentioned 7 times in the story. Outside of St. Paul himself, the wind is the main character of the story. You've missed the story if you don't pay attention to the wind. But the wind is always changing. First, it's a gentle south wind that pushes us easily out to sea. But the moment we get out there, it becomes a nor'easter. The following day, it becomes a violent wind. And you're like, hey, this thing can't make up its mind. And so the leader emerges in a situation like that. Paul goes on board as a prisoner. He comes out, the one who holds the thing together, because he knows how to hear the Lord and he knows how to adjust to the wind. Are you still with me? Yes? And that's where the story changes. In the middle of the night, Paul receives a vision from an angel that says, don't be afraid. You still have to stand trial before Caesar. Everybody on board will be alive when you get there, although the ship may take a beating. That's the message he gets in the middle of the night. 4 chapters earlier in Acts 23, Paul received a vision from the Lord who said, I need you to stand trial for me in Rome. So he gets on a ship, he heads to Rome, the storm hits, and Paul might think the deal's off. Now we're just trying to stay alive. But in the middle of the night, he hears the angel saying, wait a minute, I still need you to do what I sent you to do. All that's changed is the weather. So far, so good? Now, here's where it gets interesting. What if the ship is the church? What if the word of the Lord that morning was, the reason everything is changing and the reason you don't know what to do and you're so out of control is because you're in a storm. That's how you're supposed to feel when you're in a mess like this. Your expectations for yourself are far too high. This is not about how do we get where we're going. This is about how do we navigate the wind. So adjust your expectations and deal with the stuff in front of you today. What if the ship is the church? Well, then the thing we were learning, or should have been learning, was that we are always playing with forces beyond our control. whether we know it or not.
What if the Spirit is the wind? If we think of it that way, this story gets all the more interesting because it suggests that there were times when we were sailing against the Spirit, not because the Spirit was opposing us, but because the winds of the Spirit had changed direction and we had not altered our course correctly. The wind blew wherever it chose, John alluded. And so part of sailing is learning how to convert powerful forces that are blowing against us into a force that can propel us forward. We can't sail directly into the wind, but we can navigate the headwinds in order to propel us forward rather than push us backwards. The Spirit's the wind.
Yeah, so I'm sitting there in the night, in the morning, but I'm looking at this thing, and that's when it occurred to me. I thought, this is your fault. I can't say he agreed. I can say he didn't argue with it. The opposition I was feeling, we all were feeling, could have been friendly forces. They just happened to be blowing against us. They weren't trying to wreck us. They're trying to get us to reposition the church. Yes? What if the cargo that they threw overboard are the traditions, the programs, the stuff we've been carrying? We loaded it years ago and it worked for a while, but now when the weather has changed, we can't keep it all right now. Now, here's where it gets interesting because everybody in this room right now believes we should unload some of the cargo, just not yours. And so the minute we talk about it, you're all like, yeah, I'm all, no, not that.
Yeah.
The questions we have to answer as we're dumping stuff overboard, it's a pretty visual. Why are we here? What is essential? And what can we let go of? Now, we will argue over the third one. We have to agree on the first two. Why are we here? To make more and better disciples who transform the community and resource the greater church. Full stop. And what are the essentials outside of our dogma, our core faith? It is a commitment to that mission. Everything else is on the table. That's where it gets testy. If the cargo is the programs, some of them, God bless them, will have to go.
Well, while we're being controversial, what if the sailors on the ship are those of us in the church, the pastors, the leaders or board members, even the congregation members who in the last several years have decided to jump ship, have decided they don't want to be a part of the church anymore, probably because they were hurt in some way. If we think about it that way, then we have to look at the suggestion that Paul makes, unless you stay with the ship, you will not survive. Again, I think many people leave the church today and pursue spirituality on their own because they have been harmed in some way by the church. And they think that leaving the church is the only way to stay alive spiritually. But I think the parable suggests possibly that it's surely the way to die. And so we're encouraged here to stay the course, to stay with the ship. You know, the waves may destroy it, but that's beyond our control.
Yeah.
Our question is, are we going to stay and remain on the ship, or are we going to jump and swim on our own and give it our best shot?
So if the ship is the church, if the wind is actually the Spirit, the cargo is the stuff we've been carrying, some of which we need to unload. And the people that are abandoning the church right now because they can do it on their own are sailors who are trying to do it on their own. What if this is the last part? What if the kind of leader that's needed right now in this time is Paul? There's a lot we can say about him in this moment, in a moment of crisis. Here's a few that come to mind. One, he does know how to hear from the Lord. I mean, he does get a vision in the night from an angel, and that's a game changer. If you read the story in fast motion, not slow, the whole thing pivots when he gets that word. That's when he steps forward and boldly declares, hang on, everybody, I was visited last night in my room by an angel of the Lord. We've got to have people in our church who still know how to hear from the Lord. Two is he's not afraid of the wind. He's not always talking about getting over this storm, or I'm going to beat this storm, or I'm going to go around the storm. He's simply navigating what he can no longer control. He's discerning when he can't decide. That's a different kind of leader. And third, he has the courage, he has the nerve to act on those convictions. When he's hearing from God, he knows that the winds have shifted. He has the courage to say to people on board who all want to defect, don't leave. You will not die if you stay with the ship. So that's a different kind of leader. That's what I walked away that morning thinking God was calling me to be. All right, that's the story, Emily. At least that's where the story ends. Mm-hmm. Where are we now?
Here we are on the ship, I think. In this day and age, recognizing that the winds of change have certainly been blowing in the last 5 years. I don't know that there's anyone I know who would say that they haven't felt that in some area of their life. The pandemic of 2020, all the socio-political stuff that started and has continued since then. We feel that the world is changing around us. And one of the things that seems most called into question has been the relevancy of the church in this day and age. And so as a staff here at College Church, along with our local board of administration, and really in sessions with many of you, congregational forums and classes, we started by asking in this discernment process, what's going to hold the ship together? And the first area that we launched into was saying, let's identify what are the attributes or characteristics of us as a community that we are going to pray God develops in these next few years, believing that this is what it requires to keep the ship together. We came up with a list of 5 values. We're going to put those on the screen, and hopefully these are not unfamiliar to many of you. There are cards in the pews that you could pass along, and that list is there with some explanation. But with each of these, transformation, we're asking the question, are we people whose lives radiate the transforming power of Christ, who has and is continually refining and shaping us? In humility, are we humble recipients of the grace of God, seeking not to boast in our own abilities or accomplishments, but in what God has done for us and what his Holy Spirit makes possible in and through us in this world? Diversity, this is a controversial word in our world, but what we're asking through this value is our community, a reflection of the kingdom of God, welcoming everyone to the table to better know God through the diversity of his children. Community, do we truly participate in Christ-honoring community, that which encourages and corrects, seeking to build one another up in truth? And finally, generosity. Are we known as people who value that which is of eternal significance, freely and cheerfully offering all that we have in this life for the sake of making Christ known? We thought long and hard about these things, and we desired that each of these things would grow in each of us at College Church. But after landing on this list and having spent time discerning and praying that this is what God would have us pursue in the next few years, we also realized that there's a truth that says what you want or want to become will become evident in what you prioritize in your life. And so as we continue to work through the discernment process, we've been asking if these things that we value, and if we understand our need as a church to adapt and change with the changes that are taking place in this world and to sail with the wind, if you will, then what's it going to look like? when we live into our mission of making more and better disciples who transform the community and resource the church in the years that are ahead of us? What's that going to look like?
So
where's the wind blowing?
Yeah. So we had conversations with y'all, and there were like 200 and some of you spoke into this process. There were 147 ideas. I'm making that up. This is like letting the whole church order a pizza. What do you think's going to happen? So you imagine a board and leadership team getting into a room, shutting the door and saying, oh, dear Lord, help us discern of these 147 must-do ideas. What are the big ones that College Church needs to tackle? We're going to tag team on these things. The first main priority is we have to become more outward facing. You say, well, we are, right? We need to become more so. We're calling it loving and serving neighbors like Jesus. The two largest denominations in the country right now are, can you name them? One is the nuns and the other is the Duns. The nuns are people with no religious affiliation. They're the fastest growing. About 1/4 or more of everyone under 30 say that they have no religious affiliation. The second category are the Duns. These are people that used to attend churches but don't any longer because of the way they have seen religion abused. They're not opposed to the church. Remember, they gave their better years to the church, but they've decided now that religious organization is no longer tenable. It separates them from God. Those are the two fastest denominations in the country. Now, here's where you're right. The culture is getting more secular. Here's where you were wrong. It is also at the same time more spiritual than it was 20 years ago. What it opposes is not spirituality, it opposes organized spirituality. So if the interest is still there, but the way to reach them is not just having more interesting church plants, then we have to become more outward facing. We have to meet them out there. We don't invite people to church so we can win them to Christ. That worked in the 50s. We now come alongside them and with them discover the gospel to them. And that has to happen out there.
Second priority we identified was equipping and sending shepherds with the good news. For me, I realized in this process that sometimes God will give you an indication of where the wind is going to blow long before it blows. And I think that was the case with this one. It was back in 2016, I think, that we started talking regularly and seriously about the reality of the church not being this place or where we gather on Sundays, but rather you all out and about in your community, in the places that you work and live and serve. And we started to call our people towards recognizing their role, the rise of the laity, the priesthood of all believers. We called it all of these things. But essentially what we landed on is this is an act of shepherding, that Jesus calls us all to be spiritual guides for those that we interact with on a daily basis, not just here, but out in the places where we spend the majority of our time. I think now God was preparing us then for what we even haven't yet embarked upon quite yet. And of course, shepherding happens in a lot of different ways because you all are out serving in different places. And suddenly when we understand this responsibility, when we take up this mantle of shepherding, then the church is not limited to 200 East 38th Street. It becomes College Church in the schools of Grant County and the restaurants and the courthouses and the neighborhoods, all of these places that we're in each and every day. This has been playing out in our community. We've heard amazing stories of the work that God is calling you to do in your workplaces and in your homes. But this priority said, we've got to dial down on this and make sure that our people, the people who associate with College Church, understand that they are called and commissioned as ministers of the gospel.
So what changes with us in this room here is the third priority. And we think it has to be with how we worship, how we disciple, how we lead. And we think it has to reflect a more global perspective. Right now, the best discipleship program I've seen is from Mexico City. It's not from some megachurch in America. Right now, we have a wave of immigrants that are coming across the border. All right, I know that's a controversial issue for some of you, but just for a moment, put your weapons down, set the arguments aside, and if you think of that fact, we all agree it's happening, if you think of that fact as a change in the wind, and you consider that a good number of those people, not the ones you hear about on Fox News, other ones, are already deeply spiritual people, then you start to think of this as an opportunity. And insofar as people from different cultures and ethnicities have different forms of spirituality, we got thinking in a room with the door shut, why can't we become a community that reflects those things more beautifully, instead of always trying to settle it and figure it out and throw it together so it's nothing? Why don't we find ways to incorporate multicultural traditions that honor Jesus Christ in our discipleship programs, in our worship when we gather, and in our boards when we meet?
The fourth priority comes directly out of our mission statement. Ironically, it's the part of the mission statement. Most often people say to me, what does that mean, resourcing the greater church? What it means is a recognition that College Church is an incredibly blessed congregation with people who are examples and exemplars in so many different areas of life, so many fields of study, so many practices of crafts. This congregation is locked and loaded in so many ways. I was talking to a friend that's in another church and just explaining, oh, well, if I have a question about how I'm interpreting this text for a sermon, I can call up da-da-da-da-da. If I need help understanding what I'm doing wrong with my family's finances, I can just call da-da-da-da-da. Somebody who's going to help me be a better parent. Somebody who's going to help me understand why people are screaming, get out of the kitchen when I'm trying to play pickleball and I have no idea what I'm doing. This church is loaded with incredible resources and people who invest in one another's lives. Yes, my life as a pastor, but even more so, my life as a person. And so in resourcing the greater church, as we talked about this, what we realized is that while this is true of College Church, this is not necessarily true of every other church.
That's true. Yeah.
And God has given us wonderful connections with other churches in our denomination, in other denominations, in this country and around the world. And what if there was a way that we could share some of what God has gathered here in our people and this wonderful resource that we have with other churches, to the end that those churches were able to thrive and survive?
So how are we going to do it?
Well, we're going to get to that in a little bit, I think. You're getting ahead.
Oh, get to it.
Get to it. Well, one of the primary ways that we want to do this is through investing in pastors who are serving in churches and they're tired, they're weary, they feel like they can't go on. They have this call upon their lives, but things have gotten too difficult in the last few years. And so we've talked to many of them. They're leaving. They're going to other places to find employment. And essentially, they're abandoning this passion that God had placed in their hearts at one point in the journey. We believe that that can be rekindled. We believe that we can use our people to help motivate, inspire, and rejuvenate those who are called to the work of ministry.
And when it comes to kind of outward facing the church, we started with saying, well, wait a minute, what are we already doing? And one of the things we're doing right now, I don't know whether you know this or not, A few years ago, we started a thing called Wonder Space. It's kind of like organized play. What we found was like there's 93 counties in the state, and Grant County, I think, is number 92 in terms of some provision for children or families like parks and organized activity. We are terribly depleted in that area. So we started a thing called Wonder Space, which is organized play on the one hand, but it's also, there's a Wonder Space Blue, which deals with children who are in the grieving process. Right now, we partner with Francis Slocum's school, and they tell us more than 50 children in that school have lost a caregiver sometime in the last 18 months. Now, whatever you think about volunteerism, that is a heartbreaking statistic. So we start a thing called Wonder Space Blue, and what happens on the first session they get together, a child comes and they're showing pictures, not of Christmas, they're showing pictures of the boy at his father's funeral. You can't look at that and not be moved. The state of Indiana has discovered that this is in place, and they've said, we're looking for places that are sponsored visits. You know, when families are divided and they have to be in one certain space where it's supervised, and they're looking into the possibility of calling one of these events a supervised visit. We spent 8 people out to the West Coast to learn how to walk children through the grieving process. Imagine the opportunity to deal with children and then their families at the place where they are most vulnerable. We added to that a thing called Wonder Space EDU, which is basically a literacy program. My wife is a reading specialist, teaches reading 5 days a week in Slocum. There is nothing that brings light to a child's eyes when for the first time they try to read something and discover they were right. You got it right. Do you realize you open the world to them if they can read? If they can't, they go through life handicapped.
So we've said that our priorities of resourcing the greater church will be executed through a ministry longevity program, helping pastors to stay the course in their call. We're going to love and serve our neighbors like Jesus through ministries like Wonder Space, Blue, EDU, and Play. We've recognized that the priority of becoming and stewarding a multicultural community is not a box that we can check off. Yeah. This is a journey that we have to enter into, all hands on deck together, recognizing that what we're getting after here is the desire to have our church reflect the kingdom of God. So there are going to be times where we're going to hear from voices that are different from the voices we hear from here every week, from the pulpit and in classrooms. We're going to do things that might stretch us a little bit outside of our comfort zone. I get asked regularly, why are we singing in multiple languages all of a sudden? Why are we having global potlucks where we're asked to try food that's unfamiliar to us? What's up with the artwork that we're using that maybe is different from the artwork I grew up to appreciate? Why do we have family worship Sundays where we have the young and the not so young in the room together worshiping God? This is because we believe that this is how we come into a greater understanding of the kingdom. And we think that by exposing ourselves and even adopting practices that are perhaps different from what we've always known, that's a part of what will help us navigate the winds of change.
Last idea is a Center for Faith and Work. 8 years ago, we did a sheep to shepherd thing here, and at the end of that, we asked, how many of you would like to consider yourself a minister actually in the place where you work? You still have your job. Occupation hasn't changed, but your preoccupation has changed. You're no longer just a coach or a business leader or a stay-at-home parent. That's the platform. What you are is a disciple maker. You simply leverage the platform to make disciples. 388 people came onto this platform and took formal vows of commissioning. In the last 2 months, I have been in probably 3 or 4 different states with 3 or 4 different gatherings, very much the same way. I'll bet you we've commissioned close to 500 lay people from different states so far who are ready to consider their place of work as the fulcrum, where God will use them powerfully to make more and better disciples. We think the best way to move that forward is to organize something like a center that focuses on curriculum, apprenticeships, placement, empowerment, connection with other entities, a resource hub where anything that works is put up so other churches can use it. It just becomes a fully orbed movement with a center. We don't know where this is going to go in the Wesleyan Church. We know that the general superintendent who started it is only going to be general for a year or two more. And what I've learned from IWU is that leaders or that ideas leave when the leader does. And so what's going to happen when our leader leaves? We're saying one way to fix that is to institutionalize it before he leaves, so that whatever happens to him, there's another movement now that's pushing it forward. Does that make sense? Good. So I guess that comes down to then, what's the next step?
Well, it's a process that's moving at varying speeds. You can imagine these are 4 very different endeavors. And so a couple of ways that people are asking us, how do we get involved? What are we supposed to do at this point? Number one, I would tell you that board and staff leaders have been identified for each of these initiatives. So we have teams leading the pathways, and we're looking to get members of our congregation involved. Some of you have already responded to that call. You've completed a little form that we have. I can tell you more about that in just a minute. And we're trying to get things going. Wonder Space is already up and running, so that's a little bit different than something like the Center for Faith and Work that we're trying to just conceptualize. What is this? So be patient with us, but know it is our goal to get you involved. Second of all, if you want to get involved and you've not yet had a chance to express which of these initiatives, which of these priorities is most resonating with you, if you go to the Church Center app, hopefully you have that by now. If not, there are ways in the atrium that you can scan a QR code and get it. But go to the Church Center app. At the very bottom of the page, the home page, there's a button that says Vision 24 through 28, and it's like a 30-second form you can fill out to let us know how we can get you plugged in. If that all just went over your head, you don't know what the Church Center app is, you can email me and we'll get you connected with the right staff and board members leading the charge. The last way is really a practical way, but it's a reality that we face, and that is obviously these 4 things that we're going to do are going to cost money. And so one of the things we've recognized is that this church has been so blessed in that we have very minimal left on our mortgage for this building, just about $400,000 left to pay off this building, which is the only existing debt of this church. Once we do that, a tremendous amount of funds become liquidatable to put into these ministries of the church, and specifically the ones that are focused outside of this building. That's our goal, is to pay that mortgage off so that that money can be redirected in these ways.
That would unleash all of that, or most of that money into the programming then, right? Yeah, that would be a pretty big deal. Look, I know the second part of this morning has seemed to you more like a conference than a message. I think at least the first part of it applies to you. I think we're still trying to push through something we're supposed to cooperate with. Let me wrap it up like this. We are a church and we are a people that is born of the Spirit. We are not born of the flesh. That means we are not the only ones playing. Whatever happens in our life, a good half of it could be directed by the Spirit. So instead of asking, how do we get over this or how we get through it, why don't we just ask, what is God doing today that he wasn't doing before? And how do I adjust or adapt in order to cooperate with the winds of God? Even the headwinds are friendly forces. They just want me to go in another direction. We're going to need from this congregation, as you know, patience and humility, and when the time is right, the financial support as well. But right now, we just need you to engage with that message first in your personal life. How would you be different if you were more like a sail instead of a motor? And second, as a church, how can you engage with the ministries of our church to take us into places where the winds allow? Are you good? Yes? Sing this with me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us. Stand. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on. Melt us, mold us, melt us, mold, fill us, use us, fill us, use us, Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us. Church, that was our prayer. Now, just as we have gathered in Christ's name, we go out in Christ's name, empowered by the wind. Go where he takes you. Be fully present in that place as an extension of Jesus Christ. As you gathered, now you are sent.